Thank you very much. And I really want to take a moment to thank Boaz and Miriam for having all of us here, because I've never been to Israel before. It's absolutely exciting to be here with all of you. About testimony, because obviously the concept of testimony, the concept of bearing witness has been central to oral history research on the Holocaust for decades. And as you've heard, I sort of started as a historian of the Holocaust and then spent quite a long time working on a big oral history project on activism in the 60s, which had nothing to do with the Holocaust. I think of myself as an oral historian primarily. I think we're probably approaching a moment in time when we need to rethink the meanings and the limits of these foundational notions of testimony and bearing witness, because we're at the point now where the youngest generation of survivors of the Holocaust, so those who were children and even infants during the war, are becoming the last generation who can bear witness to their own lived experience. But child survivors have a complex relationship to their own histories, because sometimes, of course, they were too young at the time to remember the warriors directly or to remember them in a narrative fashion. So their testimony is sometimes built not only on their own memories, their own embodied memories, but on an active search for their own pasts and their familial past that sometimes is a consuming pursuit for decades. Certainly, many of the survivors I'm looking at often spent literally decades trying to find out, who am I? What happened to me during the war? How can I reconstruct my own early years when I can't really remember them? And then how can I bear witness to that period of time that I can't actively remember? So my latest book project is looking at the post-war lives of child Holocaust survivors. And that question of how you bear witness to something that you don't remember in a kind of narrative fashion, or sometimes don't remember at all, is really a central aspect of my current research. So this talk is going to explore how child survivors' narratives of their own pasts have changed over time. Now, there is nobody in my sample, most of the children, former children in my sample, are people who, they're from all over Europe, but they mostly emigrated to the United States or to Britain, a few to Canada, a few to Australia, in the post-war period. There's nobody in my sample who gave early testimony, as Boaz was talking about. So these are people who usually started to give interviews in the 1980s. So I'm going to look a bit at how the nature of those interviews have changed over time from the 1980s to the present. And I argue that one of the most significant forces shaping the changing testimony of child survivors is their relationship to the very concept of being a survivor. It's about being able to call yourself a survivor and take on a survivor's identity. I wanted to talk about three different survivors today, but actually in the end I decided I'm really going to talk about only one. So we're moving deeper in from the kind of macro to the micro here. I'm going to talk about a single survivor. Feliz, you see her on the left in this picture. She was born in 1939. She was born in the Baden area of Germany, and I don't know if you know them. Jews in the Baden area were deported to a concentration camp in the south, an internment camp in the south of France called Goes. And from there, she was rescued by an organization called DOZ, and her parents were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. I want to talk about her partly because, in some ways, her story is representative of the stories of children who lost their parents to deportation. But also because she's somebody who has given multiple interviews over time. So you can really kind of track how she changes the way in which she tells her story over time. And I want to consider how and why she's told her story at different ways, at different points in her life. And think about how those delicate changes that occur in child survivors' testimony offer insight into the emotional realities of adopting and accepting the identity of the survivor. I hate to hear the weakness of my own voice here. Right, but here she is, by the way, in 1947. She was in an orphanage run by an organization called DOZ. She's right at the very end of the first row, and her sister is sitting beside her. All the children in the picture have lost their parents in deportation, and their counselor, as she calls it, the care worker, in the back is also an Auschwitz survivor. So this kind of community of survivors. So here she is. But the first thing I really want to share with you is a timeline, not the standard timeline of how any of us would probably tell our life stories, but the timeline of how she begins to learn about herself. And actually one of the things I've thought about a lot in this current project is how very fundamental to identity it is to be able to tell your own life story, and indeed what a privilege it is to be able to tell your life story, and what a hole it leaves in your life when you cannot. So this gives you a little insight into how she begins to discover about her own past. She's 5 years old and living with a rescuer, and contrary to some of the stories you've heard from the others today, living with a rescuer she really loved and who really loved her, a peasant woman deep in the French countryside. She learns she has a sister when she sees this sister walking down the driveway. In 1947, she's 7 years old, she's living in an Ose orphanage. This is exactly where you've seen her here. She learns she has an aunt and uncle who she's never heard of this aunt and uncle. She was a tiny baby when she was deported to Gross. In 1951, she's 11 years old. She's sent to live with this aunt and uncle in New Jersey, but when she and her sister actually arrive in the States, the aunt and uncle don't want to adopt her, so she ends up in an orphanage in New Jersey, and that's where she lives until she reaches the age of majority. And I can see people shaking their heads, but this was not an uncommon story. Sorry, I can really hear my voice failing. In 1961, she's 21 years old, and in some ways this is where she starts this journey of trying to figure out who she is. And the first thing she does is she goes back to see Waldern, the little tiny village where she was born, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. At the age of 28 in 1968, she goes to visit her rescuer, Madame Patou, which is a really wonderful moment for her, but it's really not until she is in her early 40s, right? So she's in middle age, that she actually starts a very active process of trying to find out more about herself and her parents. And it's kickstarted by reading Serge Klarsfeld's memorial to the deported Jews of France. She finds her parents' names, she finds their convoy number, finds this information about them she didn't know, and it launches this process for her. And at the age of 43, in 1983, she gives her first testimony. So I guess what to point out before I move on is really what happens after this is a kind of a process of discovering herself that literally takes decades. And she is not, there's most of the people in my sample I've interviewed myself. She isn't actually someone I've interviewed myself, but we've had a number of email exchanges. And she feels like she's done now. She's found out everything she can, but it literally took decades to do. So she gives her first interview in 1983 at this very important gathering, the American gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors. It was the largest meeting of survivors ever held. There was an estimated 20,000 people there. It happened in Washington, D.C. And it included thousands of child survivors. But I use the term child survivor carefully here, I guess guardedly, because the term child survivor only actually began to be used in English after that conference, around after that time. In fact, her interview and the interviews of others that were collected are actually labeled orphan. And I think up until that point you would have heard terms like Jewish war orphan more readily than you would have heard child survivor. So for Feliz and for others like her, they actually attended without being sure that they were survivors, that their story counted as a story of survival. Keep in mind, of course, most child survivors survived in hiding. But in the early 1980s, there was certainly still a tendency to equate survivor with camp survivor. So of course, it complicates the individual's relationship with her own past, right? Am I a survivor? Am I not a survivor? Do my experiences count? So child survivors who attended the gathering often found this was an event, it was kind of a moment of possibility, but also a moment of extreme discomfort in some ways. So, like many other child survivors, she was apprehensive about coming to the gathering, and this is what she said. So this is from the interview that was conducted spontaneously at the time. So the first day I was very nervous about this gathering, so I actually really wanted to play this, but I found I just couldn't, because it's quite slow paced, I couldn't fit it into 20 minutes, so I'm going to read it with regret that you can't hear her voice. What's it going to be like? I won't know anybody, because everyone else's story is better than mine. People don't understand it. It's very hard for me to talk about it. I don't belong. I didn't go to a camp. I didn't suffer in that way. I don't have a number to show the pain. But see, I never had the parents. And actually, one of the things I regret about not playing is it's just really very emotional, and she breaks down at this point. Why did they go? and there's nothing to show for it. I worry that I'm not a survivor, but then I thought, I am a survivor in my own way. My parents died, my whole family died, besides my sister. Everyone is gone. Now, her testimony here really is quite typical of what many child survivors who gave the interviews at the time said similar things. It captures a child survivor at a moment of very raw self-awareness and emotional discomposure. She's being forced by the circumstances of the gathering to confront her own relationship with survival and begin to reframe her childhood experiences in light of this new reading of thinking, am I a survivor? In later interviews, she reflected that the 1983 gathering had been so challenging in part because one of the things she ran up against was older survivors' assumptions that child survivors were too young to remember the war years and thus too young to be affected. This is from, she gave a Fortunoff testimony in 1992, and she talks about that 1983 moment. There was this Holocaust conference. I questioned whether I should go because I'd never been in a camp. I had nothing to show for it. I wasn't in this camp or that camp, and I used to want to have a number on my arm so I could show people the pain. I remember saying, I have nothing to show for what I went through. I have no number. They used to say, you were a child. What do you know? You don't remember. This is one of the things they used to tell me at that conference. Oh, you don't remember. And again, that comes up a lot in the testimony of the witnesses. That children have been told repeatedly. Actually, the phrase that comes out the most is, you're one of the lucky ones. You're one of the, what are you talking about? You're one of the lucky ones. Only 11% of Europe's children, Jewish children, survived. So you were the lucky ones. So I was thinking about titling my book that because it's the way in which survivors engage with that concept of being a lucky one is really very fascinating. So for Feliz and others, the act of giving testimony for the first time has two powerful effects. First of all, it allows her to begin thinking about herself as a survivor, and second, it really accelerates her drive to find out about her past. If in 1983, when she first gave testimony, there were really huge gaps in her knowledge about herself, these had begun to close by later interviews. This means in her later interviews, they're both much more cohesive, and they possess a greater degree of composure, both narrative composure, as in that's a logical narrative, and emotional composure. They also reflect a firmer sense of being a narrative agent with an established identity as a survivor. In 1983, she wasn't yet sure her story counted, as I've said, but in her later interviews, it's clear she's rethought this. Of course, also, I don't have time to go into it, but obviously historical context has changed as well. In 1983, there's this moment where public Holocaust awareness is really accelerating, as is Holocaust denial. But it's kind of it's the first kind of crest of that wave, and by the time of the later interviews, this has changed in this post-Cold War climate. But that's a big thing I don't have time to go into here. To give you an example of the very subtle different ways in which she tells the story at different points. So here is from her first testimony. She's talking about that experience of going back to Waldern, Germany, as a 21-year-old. And so she describes what happened. So I went so she goes up, someone tells her to go knock on this door. She says, so I went and I knocked on the door. And I think this woman almost passed out because she thought I was my sister. And she started calling everybody in town. Everyone had to come and look. It was as if I was a movie star. There are graves of my grandparents, so I went there and I started pulling weeds. They kept saying, we had nothing to do with it. Your parents were good people, your father was a rag dealer, he delivered rags. I kept taking pictures of the house where I was born, and everybody wanted to get in the pictures. And after a while I had no more film, so I just made believe, And I left and I went to Zurich, Switzerland, and I stayed with an OSE care worker, and I literally sat there with his family. I couldn't move for a week. Now, I want to jump directly to the testimony she gives in 1998. Point is the Shoah Foundation, as with many people we've heard today. I use a lot of Shoah Foundation interviews and research. By this point, 1998, she has almost completed her reconstruction of her past, so she knows a lot more. But she's changed too. And I think it comes across in this testimony. It's the same thing she's describing. So I went down the street, I rang the bell, I showed them the passport, and I think they almost passed out. So she started calling everyone in town, saying, "You've got to come and see who's here." She took me to the cemetery, and there I saw my parents' graves, and I'm on my knees, I'm pulling the weeds out, I'm like a madman, pulling everything. And then they showed me the house where I was born, and they kept taking pictures, and everybody wanted to be in the pictures, and then they kept saying, "We had nothing to do with it, your parents were very good people, there were only 5 Jewish families." And they couldn't do anything when we were deported. It was almost like there was this guilt. They had to show that they were good people, which I'm sure that some of them were. I mean, they weren't Nazis. Compare how am I doing? 5, I can do it, okay. That disorientation of the first kind of retelling was this identity confusion. They think that she's actually her sister, and it's very clear kind of she's not really steering the process, right? She's sort of at the whim of these villagers, and she's even pretending to take pictures of them, and then she has this complete emotional collapse, which is missing from the second account, which is she's much more clearly the agent of her own desire in the second account. And one thing that is present in the second one is this purposeful uncovering of the graves, which is just not there in the first one. She's very much, I'm like a madman on my knees. I'm here to uncover my grandparents' graves. But it's a much more disorienting account, the first one. I suspect the first account is likely the better window into how she actually felt at the time, 21 years old, and her extreme emotional reaction to the visit. But of course it also reflects the emotional discomposure of the moment of testimony in 1983 at this conference. The second account also gives us valuable information about how she's changed between her first act of publicly bearing witness and her subsequent one. She has integrated the identity of the survivor firmly into her own life narrative. And it's changed the way she speaks. Right, I know I've only got about 3 minutes, so a very subtle, a very quick final point on speaking emotional truth. One of my goals in the project is to try to, as far as I can, to give agency back to these children, including, I try to follow their lives right from 1944 or 5 straight through to the present. And there's been a lot of wonderful work recently on the care of children in the early post-war period. I sometimes feel frustrated that children are not necessarily the agents in that work. And I've often noticed there's a kind of fascinating opposition between what post-war carers want for children, for orphan children, and what children wanted for themselves. Post-war carers were driven by the duty to normalize the children, like physically, psychically, and emotionally. This meant a lot of things in practice, one of which was reclaiming children for Judaism by severing their ties with Christian rescuers in some cases. But for children, one of the ways of holding on to their wartime identity was to hold on to their feelings for their rescuers in some cases. Looking at Feliz, she spent 6 years in orphanages, but she spent 4 years of the war with a rescuer who she really loved. Now her case file from the orphanage shows that she actually had a fairly gentle separation from her rescuer. She was allowed to visit the Patu family during summer holidays, and she kept a very rich correspondence. You can see a piece of it here. This is from 1950, so it's 5 years later. She's still regularly writing to her beloved rescuer. Although I did know that at some point she stops calling her mémé and starts calling her nourrice, which is more like childminder or something. So I wondered if she'd been told, don't call her mémé anymore. But compare it to the testimony she gives in 1983, where she says, "The problem is that after we were taken away from Monsieur and Madame Patu, they never could see us again. They said that they had wanted to come see us, but the agency had refused it. They really wanted to make a clean break because they weren't Jewish, and they really wanted us to start being Jewish. I couldn't even go back there until 1968. So in a sense, the historical records contradict what she says in her testimony. But if it doesn't speak to the reality of events themselves, I think it speaks to the emotional truth of what she felt, both as a child but also as an adult struggling to make sense of her childhood experiences. The oral historian Alessandro Portelli tells us that sorry, I'm losing my voice completely. What oral history is really about is not what happened in the past, but what people believe happened, what they felt happened, what they wish had happened, what they fear had happened. And I have to admit, I found this to be more strikingly true for child Holocaust survivors than any other cache of oral history I've ever worked with. It, of course, complicates the notion of testimony, but I think what I hope I've shown today is that in working with the testimony of child survivors, they are often testifying more than anything else to the loss of identity, as much as to the loss of family and the loss of homes. So in conclusion, looking at changes in child survivors' testimony over time reveals how deeply the very process of reconstructing the past itself transformed survivors' identities, memories, and emotions. The very term child survivor is a product of these transformations, and being able to access this term allowed survivors to make sense of their life trajectories in new ways. So just by having a term, it allowed a re-understanding of the past. This process also attests to the power of testimony itself. In being invited to bear witness, child survivors were also invited to reflect publicly on their lives, which had dramatic repercussions for their own understanding of the meaning and value of their life stories. Thank you very much.